Philip is somebody I've been following for probably 25 years in his writing, actually. And in recent years have found him to be a colleague and even a friend, and so I'm just delighted to be able to introduce you this morning. Philip Bess is professor of architecture at the University of Notre Dame, where he teaches graduate urban design and theory with a particular interest in Catholic and classical humanist intellectual and artistic traditions in the context of modern American life. In 2011, his graduate urban design studios began a multi-year, multi-award winning project called After Burnham, the Notre Dame Plan of Chicago 2109, which envisions metropolitan Chicago at the bicentennial of Daniel Burnham's 1909 Plan of Chicago. Professor Bess is the author of numerous articles in 3 books: City Baseball Magic, Plain Talk and Uncommon Sense About Cities and Baseball Parks, 1991, which came into the media again just last year. Inland Architecture, Subterranean Essays on Moral Order and Formal Order in Chicago, 2000. And Till We Have Built Jerusalem, Architecture, Urbanism, and the Sacred in 2006. So please welcome Philip Bess.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you all for coming. Actually, I want to begin by thanking Darren Davis and everyone associated with the Institute for Faith and Learning for inviting me here today. I've waited a long time for the opportunity to speak at Baylor. And yes, there's a story behind that cryptic remark, which you can ask me about later if you wish. But for now, suffice it to say that it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm going to show you this morning a project. Well, let me just say one thing. I realized too, imagining Burnham, Chicago after liberalism, I've sort of described all of those terms except for liberalism, but we can talk about liberalism at the end. I think maybe it'll be a little clearer, but if not, I'll try to clarify it again at the end in questions if you have any. So I'm going to show you this morning a project called the Notre Dame Plan of Chicago 2109. Chicago 2109 is a collaborative, interdisciplinary, and ongoing urban design project that originates from concerns central to the University of Notre Dame School of Architecture's unique in the world classical humanist architectural curriculum. Most of our urban design studio projects at Notre Dame are at the comparatively small scale of compact villages or urban neighborhoods, which is as it should be, I think, for beginning urban design students. But Chicago 2109's much larger scope and scale is obviously something different. The question that has prompted it is whether Western classical humanist urbanism, rooted in the Mediterranean world, extended globally by Christian missionaries and European colonialists, and central to the architecture curriculum of Notre Dame, whether this tradition has within itself sufficient artistic and intellectual resources to address the challenges posed by today's explosive worldwide growth of cities. To address this question, my collaborators and I have looked to Chicago for 3 reasons. First, because late 19th century Chicago was one of the first and most dramatic instances of rapid modern urban growth, going from about 300,000 people to 3.6 million people over the course of 60 years. Chicago grew by 500,000 people a decade for 50 years. Actually, 600,000 people per decade for 60 years. Second, because Daniel Burnham's 1909 Plan of Chicago was arguably both the first, the last, and the best serious attempt to bring principles of classical humanist urbanism to bear upon the rapid growth of the industrial city. And third, because imagining Chicago nearly 100 years forward from today and taking Burnham's classical humanist ambitions seriously affords an opportunity to critique both Burnham's 1909 vision and what Chicago has become today. So Chicago 2109 is a narrative of decline and revival. that imagines and then envisions metropolitan Chicago as a neo-Aristotelian agrarian urban unit, but at regional scale. Chicago 2109 began innocently in our fall 2011 graduate urban design studio and then grew from there with unexpected financial support from the Religion and Innovation Project out of the Historical Society at Boston University. All of my students in this studio or any studio are more happily or less happily subjected to my Aristotelian harangues that cities always and everywhere are comprised of 5 essential, overlapping, reciprocal, and competing orders. I put orders in quotes. The demographic, the environmental, the economic, the moral, and the formal. And that altogether these orders arguably exist within a larger cosmic context of sacred order. But of these urban design students in particular, the ones on the screen, I asked much more of them in terms of scale, and I remain grateful for their good cheer. We also were ably assisted by Notre Dame alums John Griffin, Jennifer Griffin, and Will Dowdy, and it's true of both students and alums that Chicago 2109 is as much, if not more, their project than it is mine. Because of the inherent complexity of cities, issues of land use, zoning, storm and wastewater management, transportation, demographic trends, public finance, building and population density, architectural aesthetics, and urban sacramentality are so closely attached to and affected by each other that it can be difficult to know just exactly how and where one should begin to speak about them. But since cities are never engaged as a blank slate, but rather always as something in media res, I want to begin with Chicago 2109's practical elements, hoping to conclude with a brief description of what has always been a central concern of the project, which is how to overtly acknowledge sacred order in urban form in a context of global urban trends that appear to be moving in exactly the opposite direction. But to get there, I need first to talk briefly but sequentially about metropolitan Chicago regional transportation and its implications for land use, human settlements, population density, and water quality, because part of what I want to argue here is that the classical humanist urban tradition embodies a holistic perspective on not only the natural environment and the built environment, but also on its own relationship to sacred order. So now the fun begins here. So appearances to the contrary, Chicago 2109 is a comparatively modest project. It is not utopian. It is not a big government prescription. Rather, it's a project to launch 1,000 projects. It's also a critique of Daniel Burnham, but even more, it's a critique of his megalomaniacal modernist successors, who always cite his famous quotation, "Make no small plans." And so make big plans. So they do, and they're bad, generally. So Chicago 29 builds off existing physical features of metropolitan Chicago, but is more modest than the previous big moves that have taken place since the Burnham Plan was promulgated. For example, the imposition of urban interstates directly through the city of Chicago, and the low-density urban infrastructure sprawl that has taken place since 1950, which are big moves that, to some extent, Chicago 2109 is trying to fix. And then it recognizes and presumes the near-term fiscal and demographic future of Illinois and Chicago as one of hard times. Its wealth-building propositions, that is, say, Chicago 2109's wealth-building propositions, therefore, take as a starting point both Metro Chicago's regional assets and, unlike in 1909, a present-day Metro Chicago economy of fiscal insolvency and scarcity rather than abundance. So just a couple of basic things about what I mean by traditional urban form, and then I'll talk about how this plays out in our thinking across a scale of a site of approximately 4,000 square miles. This is a diagram, thank God for Leon Creer, a little diagram of the formal order of traditional urbanism that is comprised of small blocks, streets and squares, background private buildings, and foreground public buildings. And his little diagram is this. You have a little, can't do this. So you have a little diagram at the top of singular buildings that are monuments, singular monuments and monumental buildings without any streets or squares. And that's the public realm. And then below it you have a kind of neutral grid of blocks that form streets and squares, but without any kind of monuments, and certainly not singular buildings, but just background buildings. And you put the public realm together and the private realm together, and you get the city. And so it's actually very close to an idea of Aristotle's polis, which is a small-scale settlement. But that's a premise of what we mean by a little diagram of traditional urbanism. And then the other thing about traditional urbanism is it is characterized by a mix of uses within pedestrian proximity. And again, Leon Creer's brilliant diagram is that an urban neighborhood is to a larger city as a slice of pizza is to the rest of the pie. It has all the ingredients that the rest of the pie has. And so there's this little, again, on the left is this little diagram. On the right, the differentiation from a modern suburb, which separates uses from each other, and it's analogous to having the crust over here and the sauce over here and the pepperoni over there and the cheese over there. And you have the ingredients of the pizza, but you don't have a pizza because a pizza has a form. And the suburbs don't have the form of cities. So, premises of the project. I'm going to start with a little bit of a project overview and go through sequentially and very briefly some of the issues that it tries to address. I want you to note on this, first of all, the land use pattern on the upper left. It's probably, you may not be able to read what's going on here, but this is the land use pattern of Chicago, metropolitan Chicago, its city and suburbs in 1936. This is what it is today in the center, and this is what we're proposing it to be in 2109. And this is an aerial view of present-day Chicago taken, it's kind of the famous Burnham bird's eye view, looking west from the Loop. This is what it is today, and this is what we're imagining it to be in 2109. And you can see the main difference. The main difference in the larger picture is the landscape and its relationship to the city. But I want you to look at this one in particular in 1936 because it represents the culmination prior to the Second World War of Chicago's historic pattern of development. It was, if you looked at a series of diagrams of maps and settlement patterns, you'd have Chicago at the intersection of the Chicago River and Lake Michigan as a settlement. It keeps growing, and then pretty soon you start to see other settlements that go out in these sort of spider web fashion. And those are the towns that were established along the rail lines that came into Chicago. So what you're seeing on the left is a big city with commuter rail lines that go out into the country and towns located along the edge of those rail lines. So in looking at kind of dealing with Chicago as it is today in that top center slide, when we began the project, we didn't really have any formal intentions in mind. In fact, when I said that we kind of bit off more than we can chew than we could chew at the outset, we were really just thinking about the city, and we realized that we couldn't just think about the city. We had to think about the metropolitan region, and which set up our studio for the following year. But we did not have a formal pattern in mind when we began to do that. So it was a consequence of studying the conditions that we came up on the right with something very similar to what exists on the left. But this is how that happened, is that we took as a given Chicago's existing regional and city transportation network because we wanted to start with existing infrastructure in place. Chicago has very good regional commuter rail, and also very good public transportation within the city. And so we looked at that as a key to thinking about what land use should be like about 90 years out. So, and so you can see on the diagram on the left, or the map on the left, that's all the existing infrastructure, trains, interstates, actually the street grids at a half mile, in the city, the bus lines, the CTA, it's the whole public transportation network, or the whole transportation network of Chicago. And on the right, of metropolitan Chicago, and on the right is that map sort of blown up in the middle. So on the right is just all the public transportation within the city of Chicago. And what you're seeing in the tan, right, is our proposal for what the human settlements should be along these public transportation lines. And it's basically governed, well, I'm jumping ahead of myself, but that's what you're looking at. So the second thing about our look at the transportation is that we're proposing to infill and re-urbanize or repurpose the interstate rights-of-way within the city of Chicago. And that's what all of this green represents. There's probably at least 100 miles of interstate right-of-way within the city of Chicago. When we set out to look at that, we started looking at it in plan and realized that that was a bad idea because the drawings would get really big. And then our students kind of figured out that this is a much better way to represent schematically the kind of thing that we have in mind. But essentially, these in-city interstate rights-of-way are proposed to be repurposed as multi-purpose use urban corridors, containing boulevards, rail, parks, wetlands, and some new real estate. So I want to go back then to look at the project overview again. The proposed land use patterns follow from the proposed transportation policies, right? So this is what the proposed land use pattern looks like without the transportation overlay, but the transportation without the transportation underlay. But that's what's determining the extent of the settlements, both in what are currently the suburbs, but also within the city of Chicago. And what's determining that? Well, I'll come back to that. Second kind of tool that we're using in this is an idea that comes from the Congress for the New Urbanism called a rural to urban transect. And it's not the rural to urban transect, but it's a rural to urban transect. How many of you have heard of this term? 2 of you, okay. It's a gradient, it's a rough gradient that distinguishes rural land from urban land, and in the most simple kind of way distinguishes 2 types of rural properties, 2 types of rural land, natural land and rural land. Natural land is land that is essentially the wild, and rural land is land that is cared for by human beings. Another way to think of it is that in T1, in the natural transect zone, human beings are potentially food. But in T2, it's agriculture and national parks and things like that. But those are the 2 rural transect zones, and then there are urban transect zones. And the purpose of showing the urban transect zones are to show the gradations that can exist within cities that are walkable mixed-use environments that run from a low density to a high density, right? So what we're saying is that urban is not just high-rises. Urban is walkable mixed-use neighborhoods, and that there's a range of densities that you can find within traditional urban settlements. And what's important about this as a tool is that it can become a basis for a different kind of zoning. Zoning is currently based upon separation of uses, but transect-based zoning, which is also called form-based codes, make building codes that are not based on separation of uses, but rather they are based on density and on building type. And the assumption is that in each of these transect zones, each of these 4 urban transect zones, a mix of use is permitted. So you may have a building type that looks like a house or that was originally built as a house, but in a transect, in a mixed-use transect zone, under a mixed-use transect-based zoning code, the house can become a funeral parlor, it can become a bed and breakfast, it can become a lawyer's office, all the kinds of things that all of you have seen in any town that existed prior to 1945, the big corner house on the, in the grid that is used for something other than a house. So form-based codes, this is the basis of form-based codes rather than use-based codes. And it's something, this kind of zoning is a necessary but not sufficient instrument for walkable mixed-use traditional urbanism. But right now, the current zoning does not allow traditional mixed-use neighborhoods as of right, and so it's necessary to presume this kind of zoning. Now, this is where I want to talk about settlement types, because this is the next element of this. We have 4 proposed metropolitan Chicago urban settlement types in a landscape, and I refer you again to Aristotle in the Politics on his idea of the polis, or his recognition that the polis itself is an agrarian urban unit. It relates to a landscape that provides food. They're both agriculture and cities are place-based, but they exist in reciprocal relationship to each other. What we're doing here is reconceiving that idea at a regional scale, and it happens by the use of 4 different settlement types. And so 2 of them are rural, which is to say these are all urban settlement types, but 2 of them exist in a rural landscape, and the other 2 exist along rail lines and public transportation. So the hamlet and the village are the rural settlements, and they exist, again, out freestanding in the landscape. Towns exist along the rail lines. Cities are the larger entity within which there is found public transportation. And the gradation of them, it goes from least dense to most dense and least area to most area, right? So there's a finite, there's a maximum area and a maximum density that you can have for a hamlet, and then a minimum to maximum area and density you can have for a village, same thing for a town, and same thing for a city neighborhood, but it goes from least dense to most dense, and smallest area to largest area. And yeah. Next, I want to say something about density. That's a critical component of this, because most people don't understand density. They think high density and they think high rises. So what I want to show you here are these 3 images. The first is from a post-war suburban sprawl neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma. But it's kind of typical of most post-war neighborhoods. Detached single-family houses on a cul-de-sac, no sidewalks, lot widths maybe 100 feet, maybe lot size of a quarter-acre minimum or half-acre minimum lot. But this particular neighborhood, low-rise, comes out at about 28,000 people. I'm sorry, 2,800 people per square mile. Chris and I were talking yesterday about the relationship of dwelling units to population, and so we're assuming in this project 2.5 people per dwelling unit. So if you wonder how many dwelling units that is, just divide by 2.5. But these are actually sort of measured census things. So the suburban neighborhood has a density of 2,800 people per square mile, low rise. The middle image is from a Chicago Railroad suburb, LaGrange, Illinois. It's a residential neighborhood made up of detached single-family houses of 2 to 3 stories. And you can see the houses, the sidewalks, the planter strips, the street, the planter strip, the sidewalk. And that has a density of about 7,000 people per square mile. So about 2.5 times the density of the suburban neighborhood. And then this is a neighborhood in Chicago. In fact, it's the street I lived on for 10 years in Chicago that has basically the same profile in terms of the height of the buildings, the section of the street. There's more cars, of course. But it's basically the same cross-section, and this has a density of 28,000 people per square mile in 2- and 3-story buildings. How does that happen? Well, one of the ways that it happens is that the street in LaGrange has 60-foot wide lots with a single-family house on it. The street in Chicago has 30-foot wide lots with 2 flats on it. So you've quadrupled the population with the same street section. So that's a thought about density because we're increasing the density of Chicago and increasing the density of the suburbs, but we're doing it all in low-rise walk-up buildings, almost all of it in low-rise walk-up buildings. So here's more about density. So this is metropolitan Chicago on the left. In 2009, the metropolitan area has about 8.4 million people that occupy 2,165 square miles at a gross density of about 3,900 people per square mile. Now, this 2165 square miles, this area here, the 7-county region that we're studying, is 4,000 square miles, right? So in this one, a little more than half of the land is occupied. In this one, well, let me go back here. So that in the region, the gross density per square mile is 3,900 people. Chicago has a population of 2.7 million, and the suburbs have a population of 5.7 million. So the density in Chicago, the gross density, is 11,000, this is existing today, 11,700 people per square mile, and in the suburbs it's a density of 3,000 people per square mile, which is very similar to that slide that I showed you from Tulsa. In the proposal for 2109, it's basically the same population. It's, in our projection, it's going to fall and then rise again, but to basically about the same population, except that the land area that's occupied is 613 square miles. So it's less than 30% of the land currently occupied is occupied in 2109. Which comes out to a regional density of 13,800 people per square mile gross, with a population in the city of Chicago of 3.6 million, which was its peak in 1950, and in the suburbs, or in what are now the suburbs, about 4.85 million. And the density in Chicago goes from 11,700 people per square mile gross now to 15,600 per square mile gross. But the density in the suburbs goes from 3,000 people per square mile now to 12,700 per square mile in 2109. More later. This is City of Chicago population land coverage. So in 2009, Chicago has a population of 2.7 million at 11,000. It occupies 231 square miles gross at 11,700 people per square mile. It occupies 222 of those square miles. So that the tan is all occupied land, and the green is open land. And so the gross density is 11,700 people per square mile. The net density is 12,200 people per square mile. In 2109, we're imagining the population at 3.6 million. Don't ask me how we got there. It was calculated. It's not just, we didn't just pull it out of a hat. But 3.6 million, again, the gross density is 15,600 people per square mile, but the net density is 21,700 people per square mile, occupying 166 square miles. So it recovers as well, it recovers 65 square miles within the city of Chicago for open land, more than what exists currently. Okay, this is related to water. So if briefly, Chicago is where it is because of its water circumstances. There is a subcontinental divide that exists, that runs through the city of Chicago, on one side of which the water goes down to the Gulf of Mexico, and on the other side of which it goes into Lake Michigan and winds up through the St. Lawrence Seaway in the North Atlantic. So that line prior to the 19th century is this. And so all the stuff on this side goes to the Great Lakes, all the stuff to this side goes to the Mississippi River. This is what it looks like today, where, how many of you have ever heard that Chicago reversed the flow of the Chicago River? So, do you know why it did that? Never mind, I'll tell you why it did that. It did that because it was sending all of its wastewater, very foul water, into Lake Michigan and polluting its drinking water. And so they dug a big canal called the Chicago Sanitarian Ship Canal, 28 miles long, across that subcontinental divide. They put locks on the lakefront entrances to the lakes, pumps, and they pump it down away from Lake Michigan, so that that's reversing the flow of the river. So basically, they sent all their wastewater down to down to the Gulf of Mexico, past St. Louis. There's a whole lot of reasons why Cubs fans and Cardinal fans don't like each other, but that's probably one of it. It's 11. Great. I'm really okay. Onward. So the proposal today, the proposal for 2109, is actually to restore that divide and to clean things up in such a way that the water on the lake side of the Continental Divide goes back to Lake Michigan, and on the Mississippi side it goes down. So what I want to talk about is this diagram right here on the left, because this is a diagram of the wastewater treatment in metropolitan Chicago, how all that land treats its wastewater, how all that settlement treats its wastewater. And what you see here in the brown is all of the active It's all of the active treatment that exists in the cities, Chicago and the three major regional cities, plus the suburbs that are treated either by active wastewater treatment plants or by untreated septic systems. Right? So that's the wastewater treatment system of present-day Chicago. This is for the city of Chicago, the storm and city treated wastewater. This is the existing condition right here, where again you can see the water flows. It starts up here and used to go into Lake Michigan, but now it's pumped down. It's now treated here. The federal government required Chicago to treat the wastewater before we sent it down to St. Louis. I don't get it. Anyway, so that's the current condition, and this is our proposed condition, where we dam that and we dam a couple of other places and clean it up in a variety of constructed wetlands, kinds of natural water treatment policies. And so for this slide, this is the diagram, the pertinent diagram, where the light tan are the towns and the hamlets and the villages that now treat their wastewater through constructed wetlands that are adjacent to them, because these are all of the towns and villages and hamlets are now either in the landscape or adjacent to the landscape. And so it's possible to do constructed wetlands wastewater treatment that returns the water directly to the ground as pure water. So you have the benefit of returning the water to the ground purified on the one hand. You also have the benefit of all of this land being opened up, and so the rainfall actually going back through permeable surface and back, we hope, to the aquifer. And so what you have in the dark brown are the various treatment plants, and again I won't go into that, but that's so this is what those constructed wetlands look like out in the suburbs. This is an imagined suburb of LaFox, Illinois, on a railroad line. And actually, so this is the dimensions of a town are 1 to 4 square miles, because a village is a square mile to 40 acres. So when you get bigger than a village, when you get to a square mile, you can't build bigger than a square mile. You can't have a village bigger than a square mile, but you can't have a town that's not on a rail line. And so the rule for a town on the rail line, we'll get to who sets these rules. The rule for a town on the rail line is that you can't be more than a mile from the rail station. And so the maximum size, more or less, the maximum size is 4 square miles for a town. And so this is a town project that shows that. And so, and what you have then at its perimeter are the constructed wetlands that treat the wastewater of this town of maximum 35,000 people. And why do I say maximum 35,000 people? Because the form-based codes and the number of dwelling units that it permits, there's a range between like 25, there's a range that would allow for between 25 and 35,000 people in the town. And so maximum, it'd be maximum about 35,000. Okay, so last couple things. The sector plan, which is a transect-based thing, but is at the scale of the metropolitan region. So I've explained the transect. This is a three-dimensional view of that, of natural, rural, suburban, general urban, urban center, and urban core, represented in three-dimensional drawing. But this is what it comes out as out in what's currently West suburban Chicago, but right on the edge of suburban sprawl. So this is Kane County, Illinois. I mentioned the town of LaFox that we were looking at. So this is the town of LaFox, the proposed town of LaFox. But what you're seeing here is urban land and rural land, right? So all the orange stuff is urban, and by urban we include hamlets and villages. And the reason that they're located where they are is because hamlets and villages are located at the intersection of major roads. And they can't extend very far because of the limits on their size. And so you get a pattern that looks, something like that. And it has to do with the actual cost of infrastructure to serve these towns. And it's a kind of a pay-as-you-go sort of thing. So the region is made up of city, Elgin, town, and then villages all around. Chris lives and teaches in Elgin. So that is based on this, right? So this is the transportation diagram system that shows the relationship of the settlement patterns to the existing transportation system, which is actually important because the reason I think our premise about why the suburbs are going to fail is that they will fail before they fail environmentally, which probably they would do, almost certainly they would do eventually. They will fail economically, and the economic failure has to do with the high cost and the extent and high cost of suburban infrastructure and the low density to support it. And if any of you are familiar with the website strongtowns.org, if you're not, I encourage you to look at it because they're keeping a very close eye on that phenomenon. The final thing having to do with the regional plan related to the sector plan is an idea for revenue generation, which is an idea called the land value tax. There are various ways in which to think about land value tax, but primarily what it does is it does not tax buildings, it does not tax improvements, it does not tax anything, it only taxes land. And you tax the land to provide sufficient revenues for running the government and providing public services. And this particular model of a land value taxation is for Kane County. And there's a story. We wrote a little fictional story. It's called Hunting LaFox. And you can Google Hunting LaFox, and it will pop up. And it'd be great if somebody read it someday. But this is a tax zone pattern. There are 13 tax zone patterns, 3 rural, 10 urban, and these are related in a certain way to that transect-based sector plan that distinguishes between rural land and urban land. And it's not that you can't develop in rural land. If you develop in rural land, you have to develop at urban tax prices, and the difference between them is significant. So it's the least valuable land in terms of taxes is rural land, in part to encourage farming. So, okay, so now I'm getting into the theoretical stuff. What time is it, Chris?
It's 10 past 11.
Okay, all right. So all of this is sort of the practical stuff that we were looking at, but it's informed by a certain view of architecture and urbanism that I contend is consistent with the way that traditional cities and traditional architecture has been made. And so I want to go through the suppositions, the kind of metaphysical suppositions, if you will, of why we've approached this problem this way, this set of problems this way. So the first idea has to do with metaphysical realism, or if any of you are familiar with C.S. Lewis's book, Abolition of Man, what he calls the Tao. And so 3 propositions. The world is real, the world is intelligible and can be known truly, even if not completely, and that human beings flourish in accordance with reality truly understood. Now, this is not, and Lewis goes to great pains to point out, this is not exclusive to Christians, it's not exclusive to biblical religion, it's an anthropological thing in terms of pre-modern societies and pre-modern assumptions. So that basically religion is essentially metaphysically realist, in spite of whatever other theological disagreements there are. They're truth claims generally that are being made, and it includes suggesting those basic suppositions. Now, if we qualify this through a lens of the biblical worldview, through Aristotelian Thomist teleology, and through Catholic sacramentality, we can say further, the world is good, although fallen and in need of redemption. The world is teleological and is moving toward its end, who is God. And the world is sacramentally charged, presenting arenas, occasions, and means for God's presence therein. Now, I want to add to that some points that at least have informed our thinking about this, having to do with human nature, the Catholic view of human nature and principles of Catholic social teaching. And I'll add the caveat that I'm painfully aware that we're in a time that these ideas have no credibility to the extent that Catholics don't actually try to live up to them. So, but we are trying in this context here. So foundation, the dignity of the human person from conception to natural death, the human person as both social animal and moral agent, requiring both virtue and grace to turn toward good and away from evil. The necessity and value of communal solidarity, civil society as a realm of multiple authoritative institutions, the relations of which are governed by the principle of subsidiarity, the common good as the purpose of civil government, and note well, civil society includes but does not equal civil government. Public policy with a bias for the needs of the involuntarily poor. And again, this is not to suggest any ideas of worthy poor, but involuntarily poor because the Catholic Church and Christians recognize that voluntary poverty can be a virtue, can be a great thing. And so it has to do with meeting the needs of the involuntarily poor. The human stewardship of creation, which the reason we're all here, and religious freedom as a fundamental human right. Late to that party, the Catholic Church. Although there are antecedents early on. So the classical humanist architecture and urbanism, together, biblical and Greek metaphysical realism and anthropology have nourished a historic Western culture of humanist architecture and urbanism, not exclusively, but nevertheless most persistently under the rubric of classicism. And what I want to do now is I want to show you 3 images of what I want to, that are characteristic images of what I'm calling classical humanist urbanism, and then modernist urbanism and hypermodern urbanism, as again, just kind of representative images. So clockwise from the bottom left, icons of classical humanist urbanism, the Ghent altarpiece, detail of the mystic adoration of the Lamb with paradise depicted as both a city and a garden. A medieval woodcut of Rome, where Rome is depicted as its pilgrimage churches inside the walls. So what Rome is are all these 7 pilgrimage churches and the various pilgrims that are going through it, but no other buildings, right? Rome is the way that Rome is depicted as all these pilgrimage churches. The World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 in Chicago, which sort of brings us into where we're going, for which Daniel Burnham was the chief engineer, by far the most influential World's Fair in the history of World's Fairs. And then this image from Daniel Burnham's plan of Chicago, which is his proposal for City Hall on a new plaza and City Hall building to the southwest of the Loop. But again, all the sort of classical humanist sensibility and architecture and urban space. On the left is maybe the icon of modernist urbanism. It's a model of Le Corbusier's Plan Voisin for Paris. Notice the buildings, they're on a grid, it's rectilinear. The city's not spatial in terms of spatial containment, but they're freestanding tall buildings, repetitive, same style, guided by ostensibly a kind of Cartesian rationality brought to bear on city planning. And in a certain way similar to classical humanist urbanism in that both are teleological, right? That classical humanist urbanism is teleological in the sense that it points toward a transcendent reference, a transcendent ideal city. Whereas what's teleological about modernist urbanism is that it too was utopian, but it was a political utopia. The idea was that utopia would be achieved in this world and would be achieved politically, and has been, I think everyone pretty much agrees, a kind of disaster. So that, now, what I want to suggest is that period of modernist urbanism, which really attained the height of its theoretical presentation in the early 1920s by Le Corbusier and others and into the 30s. I want to suggest that that's a transitional period between the classical humanist tradition and the hypermodern condition that we're in now. That it was, even though modernism was teleological, in a certain way it was like Alistair McIntyre's characterization of the Enlightenment, that it presented itself and aspired to a kind of universal rationality, but when you looked at it, it really is just a kind of mask, an unknown mask, that the Enlightenment thinkers were unaware of the mask that they were wearing that was promoting their own will to power, and it's been succeeded by a postmodern culture in which the will to power is out there. And what I want to suggest is that there's an architectural and urban analog to that, and this is it on the right. So on the right, this is an advertisement from courtesy of Financial Times. It's a collage of iconic hypermodern buildings as an icon of the hypermodern global city. So these are famous high-rises from all over the world assembled on a peninsula or an island. It could be Shanghai, it could be Manhattan, we don't know. But world business in one place, right? That is the icon, the iconography of the hypermodern city. And so here I want to talk about the first of what I call Bess's three laws. Bess's first law, and this is obviously the Empire State Building, a modernist. It's a late classical, I would say, but it's right there with the modern. It's a symbol of modernity, no question about it. And then on the right, Frank Gehry's Bilbao Museum. But the first law of architecture that I would say is that architecture represents power, always represents power, and it always aspires to legitimate authority, right? I mean, it takes power to make a significant building, and people make them because they want to present themselves as legitimate. They want to present themselves as having a certain kind of authority. So the first law is that architecture is power aspiring to authority. Bess's second law is that public bureaucracy plus individual autonomy, right, which is the condition that we're in today, public bureaucracy plus individual autonomy equals an incoherent public realm. And I present these as examples of that. And these are all hypermodernist buildings, the kinds of things that are actually being built in the world today. So these are all examples of high culture, hypermodern, individualist architectural expressionism. It's a mouthful there, but you can see they're all, and I would say that the characteristic of hypermodern architecture and urbanism is that it is not teleological. It is motivated by the desire to do something new, the desire to do something that's never been done before, and Philip Reeve had a great characterization of it, to build an environment that gives people permission to live an experimental life. That's the cultural ideal, is that you have an environment that gives people permission to live an experimental life. And so these are all examples of that, and these are all now 10 and 15 years old. The newer ones are now they're everywhere, and there are more of them by younger architects. So these are examples of architectural projects from an Ivy League graduate school that I won't mention. This is a Salvation Army sort of refugee area for the rising global seas. This is a political rally of some sort in some kind of building. This is a sort of amorphous plant blob-like thing that they've even cut a section through. They did a building section so you can see where the people are standing on the horizontal floors within the, the amorphous thing. So this is Chicago 2012, and what I want to suggest is that Chicago has become a hypermodern city. Chicago is a global city. It has all the characteristics. It's developing the characteristics of global cities that where there's a tremendous disparity between the wealthy and the poor, a shrinking middle class, and the city conducts its business with reference to other global cities and not its own state and not its own nation. Chicago is becoming very much like that. And this is the built environment downtown that I want to suggest represents in its buildings that sensibility. We're back to the Financial Times image of that, but then this other little ad, you have a series of sharks here, and the title of it, you probably can't read it, is Mergers and Acquisitions. But again, the Financial Times is graphically depicting this culture. So, what time is it now?
22 past.
22 past. Okay, I think I can be done by 11:30, I think, but I'll have to go really fast. Because now what I want to do is I want to deal with the problem, I want to show how we're trying to deal with the problem or the challenge of depicting sacred order in a hypermodern cultural context in a big city. So first, I'm going to show examples of how sacred order is represented in pre-modern Christian Europe. Just some examples from a single city in Bruges. How it was done in modern America at its founding, and the way that America responded constitutionally and physically to the challenge of religious pluralism. And then I want to show how the Notre Dame Plan of Chicago 2009 tries to address this challenge of secularism and hypermodern urbanism, how it tries to depict, tries to depict Chicago's participation in sacred order formally. So, Bruges. Now, there are no churches here in Bruges, but I'm showing this because it illustrates Bess's third law, which is that there are three things that are necessary for good urbanism. One is a public square in which laws are promulgated and wrongdoers are punished. The second is a good class of masons. And the third is the existence of a wealthy merchant class concerned about its eternal salvation. That if you have those three things, you'll have good urbanism. So this is a church. These are all the same thing. So this is a church that's fronting a public square. This is a view of the church from the square. This is the view of the square from the church. It's kind of classic relationship of the sacred building on the public space and the reciprocity between the two of them. The church lends importance to the public space. The space lends importance to the church. This is everywhere in pre-modern Europe. Bruges churches that terminate street axes, monastic quarters, religious foundations that exist within the city. This is the Béguinage, a medieval urban monastic quarter. This is the interior of that, a group of a group of residences around a church inside the walls. Old St. John's Hospital, under the sponsorship again of religious orders in medieval Europe. This is one of dozens of almshouses in Bruges called God's Houses, still in use today for the poor and the indigent. This is the interior of that. These buildings are 400 years old and still in use. Very small units, 300 to 400 square feet. Lovely, they're quite lovely. And then just the way that the religious sensibility, and again, this is in Christian culture, manifests itself in the street. So there's like 400 Madonnas on display within a mile and a half square miles in Bruges. A kind of plain one, a kind of fancy one, but they're everywhere. So the challenge of modern America, of religious pluralism in modern America, and so I want to show you some colonial cities and how they represented religion, or not just, and I would say it wasn't just they were representing religion, they were marking sacred order, they were acknowledging sacred order, they were participating in sacred order by the church buildings that they made and where they made them. And so this is Williamsburg, Virginia, 1632. There's a single state church Bruton Parish, right there, located at the main crossroads of a capital city. Okay, so that's one example. New Haven, Connecticut, 1638, where the city itself, as a 9-square grid, was essentially a microcosm of the universe. Organized around a central square, 3 churches in it. Again, the religious pluralism, but it's the city as a microcosm. So it's a central square, a formal disposition of the religious buildings, and multiple churches in one main square. New Orleans, Louisiana, Jackson Square, all of these depictions of it. So here, there, this is the church. This is the cathedral of St. Louis Cathedral, and the depiction here fronting Jackson Square. So again, singular central square, single church with a formal building disposition fronting the square. Kind of a carryover of the laws of the Indies in South America. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of towns in South America that were founded according to the laws of the Indies that have similar kind of formal composition as this. Savannah, Georgia, founded in 1733. It's polycentric, right? It's made up of a series of wards that have squares in the center of them, that have lots that are set aside specifically for civic and religious buildings. And so there's something like 13, the red buildings here are all the religious buildings in the city, some of which front wards and some of which sit at the corners. But this is kind of what it looks like here, a square. This is a typical ward right here, and the public and religious and civic buildings were located on these kinds of lots. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, 1682, polycentric, square with City Hall in it, 4 squares in formal disposition, cosmographic by virtue of that, with a political center but no designated place for churches. But it's significant here that Philadelphia was founded by Quakers, right? And so they were not really interested in that. This is a great line. So I have to say this. I mean, I went to a Quaker school. I almost became a Quaker. I have good Quaker friends, but I love it what they say about Philadelphia, that the Quakers founded Philadelphia to do good and did well. So. Port Gibson, Mississippi, which is just a kind of, small town America, and how they did churches in a linear arrangement along a main street, right? So you've got 6 or 7 different churches located in about 3/4 of a mile of Highway 61 that, as it comes into town, becomes this main street. So it's a linear arrangement, multiple churches, informally disposed. So again, America's religious pluralism and how it sort of makes place for it in American cities. Washington, D.C., okay, so most famously known, right, properly, for its axis and cross-axis. This is the original plan. This is the plan subsequent to the Macmillan Commission in 1901 that created not just it created the site for the Lincoln Memorial and created the site for the Jefferson Memorial, which didn't turn out exactly like that. But in the original, you had the Capitol building and the White House. So the completion in 2001 extended these axes to give an axis and a cross-axis, and that's the formal relationship in D.C. But it's secular, right? It's national secular. It's civic. It's national civic. So what most people don't know, what I didn't know until I did this project, is extending north on 16th Street is the kind of de facto ad hoc sacred axis, right? So here's the White House, here's 16th Street, here are the kind of buildings that you find there, and here's the number of buildings that you find along this 4-mile stretch of 16th Street north of the White House. And then finally, the Notre Dame Plan of Chicago 2109. So this is Chicago in 1900 at State and Madison, which are the 0 coordinates in the city of Chicago. And I have a picture of, I don't know if it's Dhaka or Mumbai or something, but it's a recent one. It's sort of just exactly like that. And so this is, what's happening now all over was happening in Chicago about 120 years ago. So this is a bird's eye view of the business district of Chicago in the late 19th century, right? And so it was. I mean, the businesses had essentially crowded out the churches, and the high-rises were being created. And so Burnham's plan was an attempt, and remember, it was sponsored by, or maybe not remember, I'll tell you, it was sponsored by businessmen. But Burnham's ambition was to create a kind of counterweight to the business interests of Chicago. that he justified, and I think properly, by saying that actually it would improve the business climate of Chicago. And what Burnham was about trying to create a kind of balance between the business interests of Chicago and Chicago as a civic entity. And the language that he was using to make it that was the language of classical humanist urbanism. And so this is the site that Burnham eventually chose for City Hall. But this is the organization, and the street that actually went to it didn't even exist, but this is the organization. So this drawing is actually a portion of the Burnham plan for downtown Chicago, but this is the loop, right? So this was the existing business center. And what Burnham did, Burnham located City Hall there, what he did was to create two other centers, or at least propose, so that his idea was that flanking this, the business district here would be another business district over here, and you'd have the civic center up there that created this axial condition, formal axial condition, that really gave priority, right, to the civic center. And so in these drawings, this is a view from the lake down that main axis looking west. Here's the outline of the City Hall over here. And so you can see this was the grand axis looking to the west. And then this was a section from the lake through the grand axis and through the City Hall. And that was the main formal, there were several formal gestures that Burnham was doing, but that was the big move. And so you get these famous pictures, renderings of the proposed city, of Burnham's proposed plan of Chicago. This is the Civic Center and City Hall looking east, right? And you've got the disposition along that grand axis of major elements that stretch out into the lakefront. And he had proposed putting a museum there. It wound up, that's the site of Chicago, that's the site of Buckingham Fountain. And then this is an even more famous image of Chicago, the view west on that grand axis, aerial view to the west on that grand axis. And then this is the famous image of the aerial view in front of the plaza and the new City Hall that Burnham had proposed. Now, I should go back. So the one thing I'll say about this, Burnham was trying to elevate Chicago, right? The kind of the culture of Chicago and kind of civilize the Wild West character of Chicago as a commercial city. What's interesting is that he did it as civic buildings. There's no religious dimension, right? That was acknowledged or proposed for that. He wrote about religion in the plan of Chicago, but he wrote about it with reference to the suburbs, and he made reference specifically to the problem of, that he said that we all love the European city where there's a church on the square and you have this sense of the sacred in the graveyard next to the church, but we just don't live in that kind of society anymore. It's pluralistic, and you can imagine some churches in civic centers in suburbs, but not really, but he didn't include any with respect to Chicago. He assumed that they would be there in the neighborhoods because they are in the neighborhoods, but in terms of the grand image of Chicago, religion and the sacred had nothing to do with it, except insofar as possibly the opening up of the lakefront to nature was seen as a kind of gesture toward the sacred. That's not an implausible idea. Anyway, so there's that image. So this is what actually happened, right? That was the proposal for Chicago. But what happened, this is what happened in the suburbs, and this is what happened in Chicago looking north. This is the Jane Byrne Circle interchange. And this is the beginning of the Kennedy Expressway to the north, and the Dan Ryan Expressway runs to the south. And that occupies where Burnham had proposed to locate the City Hall. So this is what was Burnham proposed in 1909, and this is what it became in 1966. Okay, so post-1945 metropolitan Chicago are freeways and sprawl and no legible civic center. So this is what Burnham proposed. This is what it became. Now, this quote, I'm going to read you this quote. You can read the quote too, but it is. So this is a quote from Meyer and Wade in their History of Chicago, Growth of a Metropolis, 1973, and they write, "It's obvious to the student of Chicago today, in 1973, that a great deal of the plan has not commended itself to public attention, but many elements have become commonplace elements of the city. Among those features," this is all emphasis added, "which have been implemented are the placing of the Chicago Circle, major focus of the city's expressway system, at a location originally designed by the plan as the Civic Center Plaza. Right? So in other words, this is the lens of modernism, right? That they looked at this, right, and saw all of these avenue arterials come in, and they thought transportation center. They didn't look at that, right? They didn't see the obelisk. They didn't see the city hall. They looked at the, and so it's the only thing that I can figure out that allows them to say that this, right, was a fulfillment of Burnham's vision, that it became a center of transportation, which is just, it's a very telling thing. So this is the Skyline of Chicago 2009. Again, I want to say that the symbolic content is the order of modern capital. And I'm getting to the end. 25 till. Okay. Well, I'm getting toward the end. So this is the area right there where the Kennedy comes through and the Dan Ryan comes there, and then the Eisenhower goes this way. And this was going to be the site of Burnham's City Hall. And so I think I told you earlier that we're repurposing all of the interstate, we're proposing that all of the interstate rights-of-way be, within the city limits of Chicago, be repurposed. And I said that it's not that ambitious a project. Well, it's not in this sense, right? When they made it, right, they had to condemn a whole bunch of property and build all this stuff. It's now currently under the jurisdiction of a single owner. And so it ought to be, in theory, if you could persuade someone that it was the right thing to do, it ought to actually be simpler to do this than it was to create it in the first place. So this is the site for that. So this was Burnham's original axis that we want to restore with a we're proposing to relocate City Hall there as a high-rise. So this is the axis that he wanted to create it. We want to restore it. It still exists to an extent, but not to the degree he intended it. But we're proposing to add a cross-axis. And so the main axis is the civic axis, and the cross-axis is the sacred axis. And how are we trying to represent the sacred in Chicago with this cross-axis? Here's kind of the diagram, the preliminary diagram of that. The cross-axis that has a single terminus of the City Hall, the east-west axis, the civic axis, the north-south axis that is open at each end, that is by inference is infinite, that is fronted by, in this case, a dozen buildings that represent the major religions that are present within the city of Chicago. That's the idea. Now, when we studied this, and when we talked about this issue of how you give expression to sacred order in a modern context, this is what the first class of students came up with. Even though we repurposed the freeway, they were very uncomfortable with the idea of giving sacred presence so much public prominence in the plan. And so they created 4 squares and located churches on them. But it's definitely a subordinate kind of thing. I think that at least the intention that some of us had and that I was pushing, and this is just an example of one of their sort of neighborhood-like squares. And in fact, if you look at this, it's not unlike the plan of Philadelphia. But it does not challenge, right, the primacy of City Hall, right, and it does not challenge the primacy of the civic axis as the more important axis. So they did this. So this was nice. But then this is what we wound up proposing as it developed subsequently. So there's the axis, Burnham's axis, and then Chicago 2009's axis and cross axis. And so this on the main axis, this is the this is the City Hall. This is the City Hall in a 3-block context of smaller buildings, and the churches or the religious buildings that show up, just 2 of the 6 on each side, and that's that view. Large. That's the 3 blocks of that synagogue, church, City Hall, but that's fronting the sacred axis. So these are the kinds of buildings that we're imagining on the sacred axis. I mean, we just randomly sort of picked out famous religious buildings from religions all over the world. But this is their disposition. right, along here. And it's a boulevard, and the boulevard is called the Columbian Exposition Boulevard, reference to an allusion to the 1893 Columbian Exposition. And then this is a depiction of the three different conditions. So this is the original proposal by Burnham, City Hall, singular. This is the existing condition now. This is the proposed condition, and the proposed condition at the intersection of Congress Street and Columbian Exposition Boulevard. And then, and this is an aerial view of that from the southeast. So the proposed new high-rise City Hall and the boulevard fronted by sacred buildings, a crossing of civic and sacred axes to replace the freeway interchange in Chicago's historic center. And again, the basic idea is that you've got a kind of, I mean, dialogue is not quite the word I want, but there's you have the commercial representation, you've got the civic representation, and you've got civic representation in a way that we think is consistent with American principles of religious freedom and a public place for religion. Now, I'm conscious that we're doing this at a moment when, you know, it's a hugely controversial thing to allow, you know, for there to be public expressions of religion, but that's a battle to be fought. So this is a view looking down Columbian Exposition Boulevard. This is the historic center of Chicago as it exists now. This is what we imagine it would look like in 2109. You can see there's a lot fewer high-rises. And we're not proposing that we would go in and, we're not proposing that any high-rises be torn down, but this is what we imagine it would look like in 90 years, minus the buildings that are not the tall buildings that are not well built enough or well loved enough to last 100 years. And it was kind of fun actually going through and eliminating the bad buildings, but we saved everything that's landmarked, you know, so anyway, so that's the image, and this is the two skylines, or the two images as they compare. And then this is our version of the view to the looking west, where you can see on the major axis, here's the high rise, here's the cross axis here, and then again the view looking east, where that's a little bit clearer. So here's the civic axis, here's the sacred axis along here. This is a good shot because you get a sense of what's left in the loop among the tall buildings there, and that's it. So, how much time did I leave?
You have about 15 minutes.
Okay.
And maybe while I have the stage here, I could say that if we can't entertain all of Phil's questions in the next 15 minutes or so, I'd be happy to go and reserve a table for 6 or 8 of us who might want to continue with. So maybe when you see me leave the room, I'll raise your hands or something. Is that okay with you?
It's fine with me. Yeah. Thank you. I have yet to figure out. I have yet to figure out an elevator speech for this. So, yes.
What's the specific purpose for not having any more high-rises, but rather that more sprawling appearance?
Well, it's actually, so I wouldn't use the word sprawl because the reason is because, well, sprawl, well, among architects, even architects who try to speak English, right, and which not all architects try to do, and I don't always manage to do it myself, but generally the word sprawl is understood to refer to a condition where you have to drive to everything, and where the buildings are freestanding, and they're low rise, and they are set some distance apart from each other, and so they don't make shaped space. They don't make streets. They don't make squares. These buildings do all of that. So these in here are actually probably 6-story buildings. I didn't talk about the role of construction in this, but we're imagining Chicago's decline and revival, that right now in Chicago, modern methods of construction are normative and traditional methods of construction are boutique. And we're imagining that traditional methods of construction will become normative and modernist methods of construction will become boutique. And the reason that why we think that traditional methods of construction will become normative is because the buildings that they make are more durable, they're more energy efficient, their carbon footprint is much lighter because their materials come very close from the earth. We're talking about bricks, stones, limestone, timber, as opposed to manufactured steel, concrete, sort of high energy materials that require a lot of energy to produce and a lot of energy to transport. And so that's what's being depicted here. And the reason that most of the buildings, most of the buildings that we're showing in both the city and the suburbs, and we're presuming for the neighborhoods of Chicago and also for the suburbs is the wrong word, for the towns and the hamlets and the villages, we're thinking that those are generally 2-story, sometimes 3-story buildings. In the historic center of Chicago, we're assuming the buildings would probably be about 6 stories because of the land value, and because 6 stories is about how high you can build with masonry construction that can still be a kind of walk-up. But there's some. We wouldn't be banning. We wouldn't be proposing to ban high-rises, but we're imagining that for environmental reasons that high-rises would, if any new high-rises that were constructed would probably be done with recycled steel, as opposed to manufactured steel, and maybe not with concrete frame at all. But again, part of this has to do with a certain assumption about the way that high-rises are financed and their life cycles. That we just don't imagine that the high-rises that are not really well-loved will last. And we're imagining that when the costs of building new ones are recognized, that won't be normative. Yes?
First of all, thank you. It was magnificent. I wish there was a way we could put you in charge of the globe.
Don't say that to an architect.
Came to mind is what about the airport or airports?
Yeah, actually, they're all there.
Okay.
They're all so. That's a good question. We're presuming that there will be flight. We're presuming that there will be cars.
But it'll be less.
Yeah. I don't. I think it's not going to go away, but it's hard to imagine that it will be as common.
Where do they fit in the maps that you were showing?
So they're where they're located now. Okay. Midway is where Midway is. O'Hare is where O'Hare is. I can back this up, maybe if you want me to. I've got to go back to the beginning, close to it, because this is all. The last part of it has all been just downtown stuff. But if we look at if I get to a city map, I can show you where they are, because there are suburban airports as well that show up in the regional plan, and I'm almost there, I think.
While he's doing that, some of those later views that you see are all watercolored in beautiful large drawings.
What have I done? I think I broke the computer. Let me take another question, and yeah.
I have perhaps two questions.
Okay.
Maybe you can choose which one you're more interested in answering.
Okay.
So the axis of where you invite religious buildings is
The sacred axis.
the sacred axis. I noticed that the buildings that you showed as examples were
Right.
they're ornate buildings.
Right.
Buildings that the city might presumably want to be figured in public places, but I wonder how you envision sort of currently suburban mega churches factoring into that axis, and if you think that the spatial restrictions will actually sort of have an influence on the way that religious life is practiced in public.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So mega churches, I'm not imagining the mega churches as a building type. The battery's running low, so if there's a plug that can be plugged in there, that's why nothing's showing. For the laptop, yeah. In fact, which of course can be moved anywhere. But if you can figure that out, I'll answer the question. I'll try to. Yeah, so mega churches. Mega churches are an automobile suburban building type, and so I think the premise of this is that there will not be any suburban building types. And again, that has to do in part for the reason that there won't be suburbs as we know them. Now there's a longer story there, but again, it has to do basically with the cost of infrastructure and what I'm imagining, and I'm probably reading too much of Chuck Marone at Strong Towns and too much of Jim Kunstler, but what I'm imagining as just the dissolution of suburbia because of its failed infrastructure, that it will start to be abandoned, it'll be a place of salvage, it'll be a place of sort of poverty, and that I have a little fiction for how all that land that used to be occupied by suburbia became agricultural and open land, and it's in that little fiction called Hunting the Fox. It has to do with a change of heart of philanthropists, among other things, and land value tax. But all that's, I'm sorry, it may seem like I'm getting away from your question, but it's related. So I'm imagining that religious communities will of necessity be forced to put buildings on land that is constrained by the settlement type, right? Which gives a bias. I mean, it's biased toward small block patterns of settlement in which when you have a lot or a block that you're building on, your building is constrained by those lots. So it doesn't imagine that people are going to be driving long distances to go, to worship on Sundays. Of necessity, it's not that it would be legally prohibited, it's just that economically it's not something that I think we're assuming that economically it's not something that will be an option. So they weren't mega churches. There was a Protestant church and there could be more than one. I mean, Presbyterian, I don't know. These were tokens, right? So they were just because Chicago's a racially mixed, or religiously pluralistic place. So.
Yeah. So the second question actually does relate. Now I see. I was wondering how you envision food moving through.
How?
Food and agricultural.
Oh, yeah.
Corridors, which maybe begin on lands reclaimed, I guess.
Oh yeah. We're imagining that a lot of that land would be repurposed. I mean, you're already close to agriculture, but so this is something that this is like a paragraph that I have to get in. If you find Hunting the Fox, it's like the 11th version. There's going to be a 12th, and I need to add a paragraph about the 50-year ag plan and the switch from 80% annuals to 20% annuals and 80% perennials. But one of the things that happens is that all of Chicago, towns, villages, hamlets, the city of Chicago are in much closer proximity to open land. And so I think the assumption is that there would be more, ideally we would produce more Michigan type stuff and less corn and soybeans.
Did your plan include markets?
Markets?
Yeah.
Well, let's see. Well, we didn't do a neighborhood plan. You mean like a market building? No, it didn't, because we were sort of working at big scale stuff. But there's a website for this project. It's not very fancy, but it's kind of a warehouse for about the 300 drawings that we have. And there's a section of it that shows student projects that were done for small towns, Lake Forest, for neighborhoods in Chicago, and I'm sure some of them have markets. So the assumption is that there would be more local agriculture. Is the assumption.
URL for the website?
It's afterburnham.com.
Good.
And the LaFox thing is on that website too. But you'll find it easier to find if you just Google LaFox, Hunting LaFox. Yeah.
I lived in Wheaton for a decade.
Oh, all right. I lived there for 3 years.
One just kind of a clarification is about on what basis you project the decline and then revival of the population, which is really interesting. And then the other, maybe more philosophically, so in your subtitles, after liberalism.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering what you take liberalism to mean, if that is that side
Yeah.
of religion from the public sphere.
Yeah.
And what you conceive of as being after
Yeah.
liberalism, and if it's kind of this, and Macintyre is almost like revival of tradition, or is it something completely different?
It's not completely different, but it's not going back, you know. But it's retrieving some things for sure. But let me so actually take me back to the first question. It was about
Just how you calculated sort of the decline of population
Oh,
and revival. Just
right. Well, so the decline of population has to do with current demographics, right, of below replacement level birth rates that are going to manifest themselves generally in declining population generally. Now, some places may grow and some places will decline precipitously, but that's a fixed thing, absent, you know, a great deal more immigration than we have, and the places that are sending immigrants to us themselves are going to be declining in population because they have below level. Many of them, most of them have below replacement birth rates, fertility rates. So that's just a kind of a demographic thing, and that again, the revival that is depicted in Hunting La Fox, you know, presumes that there's a kind of pronatalist, you know, cultural revival that at least recognizes that 2.1 is a magic number for sustaining population, which is historically necessary for sustaining any kind of prosperity. Now, that doesn't take into account automation, right? I mean, so there's all kinds of wild cards that could come up, but automation itself presumes a certain set of, you know, institutions and infrastructure that may or may not, you know, make it. And so it's the demographic decline along with the state of Illinois' finances. That they're the 50th worst governed state in the union. They're hundreds of billions of dollars in debt and doing deficit spending every year. And the courts will not let them declare bankruptcy. And at some point, they're just going to stop paying things, pensions. And people are, and the only way that they can get more money, that they can imagine getting more money right now, is to raise taxes, and it's a vicious cycle. They raise the taxes, people leave. Already there are more people leaving Illinois than any other state in the union. Chicago, has declined 200,000 people net in the last decade, and that's including 60,000 more people who've moved downtown. So it's a crisis. I mean, it's a financial crisis and a demographic crisis, and so that's our assumption. The comeback, I don't know. I'd like to think that maybe a land value tax would, you know, help do that. That's a whole other subject. So, yes. I'm sorry. Excuse me. You had a second question, and
just the after liberalism.
Okay. Are you going to be at lunch?
Go reserve a table, you've got about 2 minutes.
I got 2 minutes. Okay.
I want to hear more. I wanted to say some things yesterday. I just had to leave out about subsidiarity, and I would define it how you would, but it often gets talked about in terms that a libertarian would love, right?
Yeah,
the best
not that.
solutions are the smallest ones, but it's much more complex than that.
It's more
So I'd like,
yes.
Could you just say a little bit about how subsidiarity would play into implementing
Right.
something like this vision?
Right. Okay. Well, so the distinction I think that doesn't get made often enough about what subsidiarity is, it's not that everything happens at the lowest level. It's that everything happens at the lowest level where it can be done best, right? And so if if you need to raise an army, to defend the city or to defend the state or to defend the country, you're not going to be able to manage that by the village. I mean, the village participates, but the village doesn't run it, right? It has to be done at a scale that's appropriate, by the appropriate authority. And so you generally don't want the federal government raising your children, but you don't want Wheaton, raising the army, right? So that's so in terms of what it is, that's my understanding, which I think is a pretty standard understanding from people who think about these things. How does it work in practice? Well, again, what I foresee, what I imagine for Chicago and for the state of Illinois is this hemorrhaging of population that is going to require some ad hoc some ad hoc creation of local community to get things done. The reason why I think that there can be a revival is because Chicago and Illinois have assets. And they have assets, they have good farmland, they have proximity to fresh water, which is not to be underestimated. It's also conceivable to me in this plan that if rising sea levels actually do decimate the eastern seaboard of the United States, that Chicago would not be an unlikely place to relocate a national capital. So, I mean, I'm not advocating for that or thinking, but it's not inconceivable given the scale and given the kind of assets that it has with respect to water, its location, its proximity to agricultural land, which needs to be replenished, right? It needs to be cared for, nurtured. But that's what I see as the revival, but I see that happening. I actually see that happening locally because I don't see the federal government being able to continue to support. I mean, there's so many of these. I mean, just take freeway construction, right? I mean, so much of that just comes from the federal government, and at a certain point, I'm not sure that it can continue. But certainly with respect to local infrastructure, where the federal government sort of did the first round 60 years ago and then turned it over to the towns. Towns are not. They passed bonds for the second wave 30 years later. It's 30 years after that now. The bonds are not paid for, and they have no way of collecting the money to do the infrastructure repairs that are needing to be done. So you're already starting to see towns where the infrastructure is starting to shrink around the more dense. It's extending out to the more, just to the more dense areas.
I think the further conversation about, you really can't separate a coherent process that takes subsidiarity into account without some sense of common good. And so, what do we mean by liberal? Yeah. Yeah, the liberal thing. Yeah, I haven't. That's a good question. I've got to think about it because I'm trying to remember what I was thinking when I sent the title in, and I can't. It's escaping me now. Pat Deneen is a friend and colleague and has written about the end of liberalism, and I find his argument in some way compelling. I find Rod Dreher's Benedict option in some ways compelling, but I have another colleague. Philip Munoz, who actually thinks that the problem isn't embedded in liberalism the way that Pat thinks that it is, but that it's just that we need to be more virtuous, right? And I think to some extent that's true. But here's what I think, that even if it's as bad as Pat says, that it's kind of inevitable that it would break down into individualism and therapeutic culture the way that it has, I think that even if there arise these ad hoc communities, whether they're religious or secular or whatever that makes them a community, whatever goals they're pursuing, to the extent that makes them a community, I think that they will be a community in a kind of liberal American way, in the same way that Benedict, right, the original Benedict, who was Roman aristocracy, he left that behind and then established these foundations where effectively he was providing a sacred model of the Roman paterfamilias organization of the household, and the same kinds of building types, organized around a cloister and a court. So that Benedict, in sort of saying goodbye to Roman culture, did not cease to be Roman. And in the same way that I think that Americans saying goodbye to American liberalism, we will not cease to be liberal in what I think are ways that I think liberalism warrants being preserved. So I don't. So that's a cloudy crystal ball to me. But it seems we're in a problematic situation. So I can take one more, but we can go. We can, if you want to. Thank you very much.